So I actually stumbled into this project. When I first moved to Seattle as a graduate student at the University of Washington, I had signed up to volunteer with an organization there called Chaya Seattle. It's now changed names. But at the time, it was one of the few domestic violence organizations that was existing in the country that was aimed specifically at the South Asian community. And what Chaya intended to do was both work towards ending family-based violence, but also creating a broader sense of community in the South Asian community. Now, Seattle is an interesting place because it has a long history of immigration of people coming from India, Pakistan. But more recently, it's experienced a very strong influx of people coming to work in the tech industries. So Chaya was interested in trying to reach out to some of the women in particular that were coming through the workers that were working in these tech industries, because they were finding that many of the women were either in very isolated circumstances or they were in sort of insecure family situations. And because of that combination of insecurity and isolation, some of the women ended up in these situations of intimate partner violence. So they were interested in trying to figure out, how do we begin to reach these women and how do we begin to serve them? And as they started to investigate some of that, the conditions of what these women were experiencing, what they found was that there's something very peculiar about the visa that they were on, which is the H-4 family reunification visa. It's a visa that's issued to people who are the spouses or dependents of H-1B temporary workers. And the H-1B visa program has been used in the United States to bring in foreign high-skilled workers in specific occupations that require specialty skills. So they had known that the H-1B program was bringing in a lot of folks from around the world, but in particular from India. But what was becoming more of a challenge was that the program was also bringing in many of these women who weren't being integrated into some of the community spaces that had existed either previously or that were being created at the time. So I began as a graduate student to volunteer with Chaya to think about, how do we reach some of these women and how do we begin to help integrate them into the community spaces that do exist, even before they hit the point of violence or family discord. So that's actually how I became interested in this particular population, was through this volunteer work. And I was a young graduate student thinking I wanted to do something related to the South Asian community. The gender component became really clear right off the bat for me. I was also in a feminist studies PhD program, so my interest already was predisposed towards thinking about, how do we understand gender as part of larger social and political phenomenon? And so when this project with Chaya began to evolve, I saw it as an opportunity to bring some of the skills that I was learning through my graduate program to bear on the work that they were doing as an advocacy organization. From there, the project actually grew a bit bigger than just the question of family violence. And instead, I began to become more interested as I got to know folks more intimately as well. I became more interested in what their lives were like now that they were part of this sort of temporary form of migration, but at the same time, they were settling down, buying houses, having children. The temporariness did not seem very temporary to me. That was sort of the impetus for wanting to do a larger study on how this new form of immigration, this sort of temporary immigration, was in fact changing, adding to, reshaping some of the forms of immigration that we have understood historically in the United States. So high-skilled immigration is something that is actually a relatively new phenomenon in the sense that we have named it as such. High-skilled immigration, the program that I study in particular, the H-1B program, only came into existence in 1990. It's interestingly had been an outgrowth of the Bracero program, which is a program that was initiated in the 1950s to bring in temporary agricultural workers from Mexico to the United States. In 1990, under George H. Bush, the program was revamped to focus on what are called specialty occupations, or occupations that require people to have at least some base level of training or special skills. And this was in part because companies that were expanding rapidly in the fields of information technology were finding that there was a lag between the numbers of skilled applicants that they had in the United States and the jobs that they were looking to fill. So one of the solutions was to open up a visa that would help attract that sort of global talent to the United States. It was also in anticipation of Y2K coming around the corner as well, a decade later. But the program was then used as a way to bring in workers that could help build out and support our technology infrastructure as we began to see a real acceleration in the technology space in the United States. So high-skilled immigration in that sense is a relatively new sort of way of thinking about immigration. Now, we have always prioritized skills in the United States. In 1965, the Immigration Act that is the basis of our immigration system today, the Hart-Celler Act, actually used education and skills as one of the criteria for prioritizing people's immigration to the U.S., along with family-based reunification. But high-skilled immigration became this new avenue that allowed people to come here without having necessarily a family member to sponsor them, but instead to come specifically for work. It's also deeply tied to other kinds of immigration. As I just mentioned, the Bracero program was the impetus for this sort of new high-skilled program, and yet they were really aimed at two different populations of workers, agricultural workers, and then folks coming with these specialty training and occupations. At the same time, the H-1B program, as I argue in my book, High-Tech Housewives, is not something that we can think of as just being about high-skilled migration. It's something that has also allowed a whole host of other folks to come into the country, including spouses, children, elders, folks that are what we would think of as being part of family forms of migration. So people that are not necessarily the workers themselves, but all the people around them. So the high-skilled component of immigration, I think, has become something very visible. But what's very invisible are the ways in which that program has actually created all of these other forms of immigration and connect to other types of migration as well. So in particular, family reunification was something that was very key to how the high-skilled program was conceptualized. So when it was the Bracero program, the agricultural workers could not bring in family members. They were here by themselves. The intention was that they would go back to their home countries. Once it became a program that was aimed at attracting and retaining high-skilled immigrants, one of the first things that one of the first pieces of policies that evolved was around family reunification and letting people bring their spouses and families with them. More recently, I've been interested in how this kind of high-skilled immigration has also created new forms of insecurity or also precariousness as well. So it's not simply that people are coming here to work in their professions, but also with these other family members that are coming, they are now having to figure out what happens after the terms of the high-skilled visas are done. So historically, you could apply for green cards and stay, but that's becoming harder because of the fact that there is a backlog in the processing of green card applications. So family members that had been able to come with these high-skilled workers and eventually become permanent residents are finding themselves waiting in very long lines. For the children of these workers, this is becoming a particular problem because they're finding that as they're waiting to become permanent residents or citizens, sometimes their visas will actually expire. And so they're not able to stay here. They need to either leave the country or find a different way of being here in the United States. And so there's causing a lot of insecurity and instability within the family units themselves. And that's very closely linked to the other kinds of instabilities we're seeing through family separation, through the attempts to cut back on family reunification or to end what's being termed as chain migration. So there's ways in which this program is very closely linked to other forms of immigration here. So in High Tech Housewives, I wanted to take a slightly different approach to thinking about high-skilled immigration. A lot of the literature on the H-1B program has really focused on the workers themselves. And I should say that 85% of H-1B visa holders are men. So even though you've got this large population of mostly men coming to work in the United States, you also have this very large population of spouses and children that are coming in as well. So when I began to become interested in this program and trying to understand how it fit into other and older forms of South Asian immigration, it became clear to me that the women had a very important role to play as spouses. The title of my book, High Tech Housewives, actually is a way to signal the roles that these women play, both socially and economically, in the household, even though they're considered to be non-wage earning actors. They're people who are here as family units, a part of family units, but they're not here as the primary income earner themselves. What I really wanted to show and highlight through the book was that in fact, these women actually add significant amounts of value, both economically and socially, to the communities in which they live. So many of these women end up volunteering extensively, either for the schools where their children might attend, for libraries, but also for companies themselves, too. Many of the spouses of these high-tech workers tend to be highly educated and highly skilled themselves, but because of the restrictions around family reunification, they're not allowed to work in the United States. So you've got this population of highly trained, highly educated women, mostly, that are now stuck at home, that had once either had careers or imagined that they would be having careers. So they're doing things like volunteering on all kinds of projects, including for the fields in which they had previously worked, often without pay, as a way to keep their resumes sharp or to keep their skills evolving. So I was interested in thinking about those other forms of value that we don't necessarily capture when we think of just a primary income earner. So we're in a moment of real flux around how we think about and understand the role of immigration in our society and in our economy. Historically, the United States, we think of ourselves as being a country of immigrants, right? This is a phrase that we hear often. I think that we're in a moment where we're beginning to think about how we are actually living up to that self-identification. So immigration in the United States has always, again, had this component that's been very closely tied to labor, whether it's high-skilled or not. In the United States, we've had periods of restriction and we've had periods of expansion depending on, again, politics, but then also our labor needs at the time. So as early as the 1800s, we've seen periods of both expansion, particularly thinking about, say, the need for laborers to expand the railroad system, other kind of development of our western frontiers. But at the same time, there was a real backlash as well in wanting to, where American workers felt as though these foreign workers were competing for the same kinds of jobs and benefits that they were. And so we saw a period of exclusion come up in the 1880s that really lasted through the end of World War II. With the sort of space race and the changes in our global economy and political structures after the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, we saw again another period of opening, of the desire to bring in folks that have skills that would really help build out the United States. 1990 was another moment of opening, and now we're in a moment of backlash. So in some ways, immigration in our country historically has always been cyclical. We've always seen these moments of expansion and retraction. What makes this moment unique is the incredible interconnectedness of our world today. So the reason that technology has become such a vital component of how we understand immigration is because of the fact that we have companies and so many different sort of processes that are spread out over the globe that require people to be working on something at the same time, right? So the idea that you might have a company that's building a product in Redmond, Washington, that has a support team in India is actually quite common, right? And so the idea that those workers in India might eventually come to the United States is also part of that same system of work, at least from the corporation side. What's been harder is the actual human element, the actual impact of what happens when people do make that move across borders. So in that sense, I think that immigration and high-skilled immigration has been always very vital to the growth of our economy and our country. It's also something that can feel very unsettling because people are coming in and are also now seen as a threat to workers that are existing already. At the same time, as our economies, as our lives become more globally interconnected and integrated, I think that it will be harder and harder to shut the door to this kind of movement. In terms of where we're headed next, I think that we will continue to see the same sorts of desires for people to want to come to the United States. At the same time, I think there's more reservation as we are in a period of retraction. We're in a period of restriction. And we've already seen some declines in terms of foreign students wanting to come to the United States, or if people do come to the U.S. for work, rather than trying to stay here long term, but maybe looking elsewhere like Canada or Australia. So I think that unless we're vigilant to the role that these kind of immigration programs play in our society, our economy, and our politics, we are at risk of losing very talented folks and folks who have already invested a great deal in the United States. So I've always imagined myself to be an activist scholar that is interested in thinking about how do we take the work of the academy and use it in all different types of arenas. So I've been an oral historian and worked with putting together museum exhibits. I've been somebody who has been interested in taking the kind of deep qualitative and ethnographic work that I do and using that for policy change. So next for me is actually working more closely with partners that are interested in immigration reform and thinking about how do I take some of the stories that I've been collecting and helping them make an argument that both humanizes and also makes the case that we need to be thinking more expansively about our immigration system. So that's next on my horizon is continuing to think about the work that I'm doing with high-skilled communities as well as other kinds of immigrant communities. I'm currently working on a project that's looking at undocumented South Asian youth migration as well. And how does that fit into this landscape of precariousness and insecurity, but also opportunity that comes through migration to the United States?